first time I saw a dead man drink coffee, I nearly screamed. His skin was gray, the texture of old paper. His fingers left streaks of damp rot on the porcelain cup. And when he lifted it to his lips, the steam curled unnaturally, drifting backward as if the air itself rejected his presence. He didn't blink, didn't breathe, just sat there in the candlelit shop, sipping quietly, the liquid vanishing into a mouth that led nowhere. That was my first night at Hargrave's, a coffee shop that doesn't exist on any map. It stands on an old cobblestone street that smells of damp earth and something rotting beneath the stones. It has no modern lights, no cash register, just a handwritten list of rules and a staff that doesn't last long. Because once you start working here, you don't quit. You either follow the rules or you disappear. I never should have taken the job. The ad was strange from the start. Night shift barista wanted, discretion required, apply in person, no references needed. A coffee shop that only operated at night? That alone was odd enough, but I was desperate. Rent was overdue, and I had no other options. When I arrived, the place was dimly lit by candle sconces, the air heavy with the scent of antique wood and something floral, lavender? No, something more bitter. The sign above the door simply read Hargrave's, the name chiseled so deeply into the old oak that it looked like claw marks. An old man sat behind the counter, his skin pale, almost waxy. His thin lips barely moved when he spoke. "You're the new one then," he muttered, sliding a single sheet of parchment toward me. "Sign here." I hesitated. The paper was rough like aged vellum, and the ink was dark as blood. The rules were handwritten in elegant script, but the words made my stomach twist. The rules of Hargrave's night shift. Rule number 1, do not acknowledge the patrons if they do not acknowledge you first. Some do not wish to be seen. Rule number 2, if a man in a black coat orders the usual, serve him immediately and do not meet his eyes. Rule number 3, at precisely 3:13 a.m., you must lock the doors, even if someone is still inside. Rule number 4, the woman in the white dress will come at dawn. Do not speak to her. Do not look at her hands. Rule number 5, if you hear your name whispered from the back room, clock out immediately and leave without turning around. I laughed, assuming it was some elaborate gimmick, but the old man's expression didn't change. He simply held out a quill, not a pen. A quill. The moment the tip scratched across the page, a sharp click echoed through the shop. The lights dimmed, the air grew colder, and the old man smiled for the first time. His teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too many. You start tonight. The first hour was quiet. The shop was oddly still, even though the air felt thick, like something unseen was pressing down on my shoulders. The furniture was mismatched. Ornate Victorian chairs beside rough wooden tables, candle holders dripping with wax that looked more like melted skin than wax. There was no menu, just a single wooden board above the counter listing drinks I didn't recognize. Elderwood Brew, Blackthorn Elixir, Nightshade Blend. I wasn't even sure how to make them, but as soon as the first customer stepped inside, my hands moved on their own. A woman in a tattered velvet cloak entered without a sound, her dress whispering against the floor. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her lips stained a deep wine red. She sat at the corner table, folding her hands in her lap. I swallowed hard and forced myself to look away. Do not acknowledge the patrons if they do not acknowledge you first. The first rule, I followed it. I had to. More customers arrived, none of them speaking, none of them looking directly at me. A man missing 2 fingers. A girl whose dress was soaked at the hem, as if she had walked straight from a river. A hunched figure in the farthest corner, rocking slightly, his breath wheezing like air escaping a dying throat. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., the door swung open, and he stepped inside. A tall man in a black coat. His face was hidden by the brim of his hat, his hands gloved in fine leather. He moved without sound, like a shadow with weight. He approached the counter and tilted his head slightly. The usual. His voice was wrong, hollow, as if coming from somewhere far away, somewhere cold and empty. I didn't hesitate. My hands moved automatically, brewing something thick and dark, an aroma rising that made my stomach churn. It smelled like burnt wood, like forgotten places, like sorrow. I placed the cup before him, keeping my gaze firmly on the counter. He lifted it slowly, sipping in silence. The moment he drank, the shadows around him moved, lengthening, stretching toward me like fingers of ink spilling across the floor. My breath hitched, but I didn't move. I didn't dare. He finished his drink, set the cup down, and then he left. The shadows receded. I exhaled, my hands trembling. I had followed the rule. I had survived. But the night wasn't over. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I bolted the doors, my hands shaking against the lock. The moment I turned back to the shop, something had changed. The candlelight flickered, and the air grew dense, pressing against my chest. The patrons were no longer sipping their drinks, they were staring at me. Their hollow eyes reflecting the dim light, mouths slightly open as if mid-whisper. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. Then, I heard it. A soft, feminine voice from the back room, calling my name. I went cold. If you hear your name whispered from the back room, clock out immediately and leave without turning around. The last rule. My feet refused to move. The whisper came again, closer now. My pulse hammered as I reached for my coat, fumbling with the buttons. Then something scratched against the door behind the counter. I bolted. I didn't clock out. I didn't look back. I just ran, shoving through the front door into the empty street, my breath ragged in the freezing air. Behind me, Hargraves sat in silence. No light, no sound, as if the shop had never been open at all. And yet, as I turned the corner, my name whispered again, this time from just behind me. I didn't look, but I could feel the breath against my neck. And I knew. I wasn't alone. Even though the street was empty, even though the night was still, something followed me. It didn't make a sound. It didn't need to. The air behind me felt thicker, denser, like something unseen was reaching out, pressing against my spine. I forced myself to keep walking, to not look back, because I knew, somehow, that if I turned around, I would see something I wasn't supposed to. Something that would change me. Hargraves loomed behind me, its windows dark now, as if it had never been open at all. The candlelight inside had vanished the moment I ran, swallowed by the kind of silence that only dead places can hold. My breath came in sharp gasps, my pulse hammering in my ears. I walked faster. Then, a voice. Soft, right behind me. You forgot to clock out. My body went ice cold. The voice wasn't normal. It wasn't loud, wasn't whispering. Just there. Too close. Too wrong. I squeezed my eyes shut and kept walking. The cold air bit into my skin, but the deeper chill came from something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. Something from inside Hargraves. I turned the corner, my heart pounding. Streetlights flickered above me, their glow weak against the swallowing dark. I reached my apartment building, fumbled for my keys, shoved the door open. The second I stepped inside, I slammed it shut, bolted the lock, and pressed my back against the wood. My lungs ached from holding my breath. I was safe, or so I thought. The moment I let my guard down, the air inside my apartment shifted. It felt wrong. Not colder, not darker, just off. Like stepping into a room that someone else had been in just moments before, their presence still lingering. I stood there, unmoving, my fingers tightening around my keys. Then I saw them, the footprints, damp, uneven, leading from the front door to my kitchen. My stomach twisted. I hadn't heard anything. No door opening, no footsteps, but someone or something had been inside. Maybe was still inside. My breaths came in short, panicked bursts. The rules. I remembered the rules. If you hear your name whispered from the back room, clock out immediately and leave without turning around. I hadn't followed the last part. I had left, but I had looked. Not back into the coffee shop, but at the street, at the door, at the shadows stretching where they shouldn't have. Had that been enough? Had I broken the rule? I swallowed hard and took a slow step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath me. I reached for the light switch. Then I heard it, the faintest shift of fabric, like someone adjusting in a chair. In my kitchen. I didn't move. My fingers hovered over the switch, my entire body screaming for me to run. But I was trapped. The door was behind me, but whatever was in my apartment was between me and the only way out. I clenched my teeth, forcing my breath to steady. I could feel it watching me. Something old, something that knew my name. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. And then, knock. Knock, knock. Not on my front door, on the inside of my kitchen wall. My stomach dropped. That wall didn't lead anywhere. The apartment layout was identical on every floor. That wall was just a barrier between me and my neighbor's unit. Nothing should have been knocking from inside it. My mind raced. I had lived here for months. That wall had always been solid. No vents, no pipes, no gaps. Then I realized something even worse. The The knocks weren't asking to be let in. They were asking me to come closer. I stumbled back, my hand finally flipping the light switch. The kitchen flooded with dim yellow light, the shadows pulling back. My stomach twisted. The chair at my kitchen table was slightly pulled out. The footprints had stopped there, but no one was sitting in it. No one I could see. I didn't sleep that night. By the time the sun rose, the air in my apartment had returned to normal. The footprints were gone. The chair was back in place. It was as if nothing had happened, as if it had all been in my head. But I knew better. I had made a mistake. I had broken a rule. And something from Hargraves had followed me home. The next night, I had no choice but to return to work. I didn't want to go back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to quit, to never set foot inside that cursed place again. But Hargraves doesn't just let you go. It drags you back, one way or another. And after what had followed me home last night, I knew I didn't have a choice. I had broken a rule. I had to fix it. The night air was heavy, thick with the scent of wet cobblestones and something faintly metallic. My footsteps echoed as I walked down the abandoned street, my hands shoved deep into my pockets to stop them from shaking. The coffee shop loomed ahead, its warped wooden door slightly open, as if it had been expecting me. The sign on the front, old, rusted brass letters spelling out Hargraves Coffee and Tea, established 1786, seemed darker than usual, more tarnished. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The moment the door shut behind me, the temperature dropped. Candlelight flickered along the walls, casting long, twisting shadows. The scent of roasted coffee beans was overpowered by something else, earthy, damp, like the smell of old graves. The chairs were all perfectly arranged, each table set with delicate porcelain cups and silver spoons. But I knew better. They weren't empty. They only looked that way. I forced myself to walk toward the counter, my eyes fixed straight ahead. The wooden floor creaked beneath me, groaning like something beneath it was moving. The coffee shop felt alive. Watching, waiting. Then I saw it. The rule sheet. It hadn't been there before, but now, neatly placed beside the register, was the same yellowed paper I had read my first night. The rules were handwritten in elegant script, but one of them was different now. Rule number 6. If you break a rule, you must accept the consequences. They will tell you what to do. I didn't remember a rule number 6. A cold sweat prickled at my skin. The words, "they will tell you what to do," crawled into my skull, making my stomach twist. I turned away from the counter, suddenly desperate to see another human face, to confirm that I wasn't the only living thing in this place. That's when I saw her. She stood near the back of the shop, half hidden in the candlelight. A woman in a long, dark dress, her pale hands clasped in front of her. Her face was obscured, her hair falling in loose strands over her cheeks. My pulse pounded. She hadn't been there a second ago. The air in the shop thickened. She raised her head slowly. Her eyes were wrong, not empty, not hollow, too full, swirling with something ancient, something that didn't belong here. Then she spoke. "You have broken a rule." Her voice was soft, almost polite. That made it worse. My throat tightened. I didn't know what to say. The candle flames flickered violently, casting strange, shifting shapes along the walls. She took a step forward. "You let something follow you home." I swallowed hard. I didn't mean to. My own voice sounded small. Weak. That doesn't matter. She tilted her head slightly, the movement unnatural, like a marionette on invisible strings. "You must set things right." My stomach churned. "How?" For the first time, she smiled. It was the kind of smile that shouldn't exist on a human face. Too wide, too knowing. "You must feed it." The words crawled into my brain, sending ice down my spine. Feed it? My voice barely worked. She nodded, taking another slow step forward. The floor didn't creak beneath her. "It is hungry. That is why it followed you. That is why it knocked." Her head tilted the other way, as if studying me. "If you do not feed it, it will take something from you instead." My breath caught. What? What do I feed it?" The woman didn't answer. She simply reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small wooden box. She extended it toward me, and for a second I hesitated, but something in my bones, something old and terrified, forced me to take it. The second my fingers touched the wood, a sharp chill shot through my veins. The box was light. Too light. I hesitated, but the woman only whispered, "Before sunrise." Then the candles guttered out all at once, plunging the shop into darkness. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. When my eyes adjusted, the woman was gone. The coffee shop was silent again, the same eerie, unnatural stillness hanging in the air. But the box was still in my hands. I turned and bolted for the door. The street outside was deserted. The fog had rolled in thicker now, muffling the sound of my frantic footsteps. My breath came in short gasps as I made my way back to my apartment, the box clutched tightly in my hands. By the time I reached my door, the sky was still pitch black. No stars, no moon, just an endless, swallowing dark. I stepped inside my apartment and locked the door behind me. The air was wrong again. It knew I had brought the box. My hands trembled as I turned on the kitchen light, my stomach twisting with a sickening sense of dread. I placed the box on the table, staring at it like it might move on its own. Then, knock, 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 from the kitchen wall. Louder this time, more insistent. My chest tightened. The thing from last night, it was still here, still waiting, still hungry. With shaking fingers, I reached for the box. The wood was ice cold beneath my hands. Slowly, carefully, I lifted the lid, and inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a single severed tooth. Not old, not yellowed, fresh. The root still slick with something dark and wet. My stomach turned. I clapped the lid shut, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The knocks at the wall stopped, but I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. The woman's voice echoed me before sunrise. I had until dawn to feed it, or it would take something from me. The words clawed at my skull, each syllable throbbing like a pulse. The air inside my apartment felt too thick, like I was breathing in something rotten, something alive. The single severed tooth inside the wooden box sat on the table, an unholy thing, fresh and wet at the root. I didn't want to touch it again, but I had no choice. The silence was unbearable. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound crawled out from the kitchen wall, closer this time, heavier. It wasn't a polite knock, it was a warning. My breath hitched. My fingers twitched toward the box, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Eat it? Bury it? Offer it like some kind of sacrifice? The woman at Hargrave's hadn't told me how to feed it, only that I had to. I reached out with a shaking hand, forcing my fingers to curl around the edges of the box. It was still unnaturally cold. Slowly, carefully, I lifted the lid again. The tooth was gone. A cold shock ripped through me. My stomach twisted into a knot. I slammed the lid shut, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. The table felt suddenly wrong beneath my fingertips, like the wood itself was shifting under my hands. And then I felt it. Something wet, something warm. I pulled my hand back and choked on my breath. Blood. A single dark smear of blood streaked across the tabletop, fresh and glistening. I hadn't cut myself. I hadn't touched anything sharp. But the blood was there, soaking into the wood, pooling at the edges. The knocks came again, faster, louder. I staggered back, my chest tightening, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The walls around me seemed to breathe, the shadows stretching, twisting. Then a whisper. Not from the walls, from the box. My vision blurred, nausea rolling through me. The sound wasn't in my ears, it was in my skull, scraping along the edges of my mind. Words I couldn't understand, syllables that felt wrong in any human language. The candle on my counter flickered violently. And then the whisper changed. It was saying my name. I threw the box across the kitchen. It hit the floor with a hollow thud, the lid snapping open, the black velvet inside shifting. My breath caught. The thing inside was different now. Not a tooth, a finger. A clean, pale human finger, severed at the knuckle, the nail still neatly trimmed. The skin was smooth, too smooth, like it had been preserved for centuries. And then the worst part. The nail twitched. A sharp gasp tore from my throat as I stumbled backward, slamming into the fridge. The cold metal was the only thing keeping me upright. The air around me was electric, thrumming like something was pressing against reality itself. Something trying to force its way through. The whisper came again, closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But when I opened my eyes, the finger was gone. In its place was something worse, a handprint, pressed into the inside of the box's lid, as if something had placed its palm there and pushed. The print was too large for a normal human hand, and it was smeared like the fingers had dragged across the surface, reaching. My entire body locked up. The lights flickered. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. Not mine. Not human. I had to get out. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock, my hands slick with sweat. My fingers slipped. The knob wouldn't turn. Then, Bang! A deafening pound rattled the walls. Bang, bang, bang. The knocks weren't coming from the kitchen anymore. They were coming from inside the apartment, right behind me. I froze. The air turned to ice. My breath came out in short, frantic gasps, my fingers still clawing at the lock. Then a voice, low, hungry, right against my ear. It's still hungry. A strangled scream tore from my throat as I ripped the door open and threw myself into the hallway. I didn't stop running. Down the stairs, past the flickering hallway lights, out into the freezing night air. I didn't stop until I reached Hargrave's. The shop stood silent, the candles inside still flickering, waiting. I shoved open the door, stumbling inside, my breath ragged. The shop smelled like old books and coffee beans, the same faintly metallic scent I had noticed before. And there she was, the woman in the dark dress, standing at the counter. She tilted her head slightly as if she had expected me all along. "You fed it the wrong thing," she said softly. My chest heaved. I didn't know what. "You must fix it." Her voice was gentle, too gentle. I swallowed hard. "How?" Her smile was slow, deliberate. "You must feed it something more." The floorboards beneath me groaned. The candles flickered. Then I heard it. A voice, muffled, distorted, coming from inside the box I had thrown. A voice I knew, a voice that made my stomach drop into a pit of ice. It was my own, whispering, begging, pleading for something I couldn't understand. The woman only smiled wider. "You have until sunrise." The candles went out, the shop fell into total darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, something was breathing. The sound of breathing filled the darkness. Heavy, wet, too close. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Something was in the shop with me. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. The scent of old books and roasted coffee had rotted into something foul, something I could taste at the back of my throat, like rust, like decay. The whispering hadn't stopped. It still slithered from the box I had thrown. My own voice, begging, pleading. I forced myself to breathe, my fingers curling into my palms until my nails bit into my skin. The woman, the one in the dark dress, she was still there, standing behind the counter, watching. "You're wasting time." Her voice was smooth, almost bored. I swallowed hard. My mouth was too dry. What do I need to feed it?" The whispering inside the box grew louder. She tilted her head. Something more. A low, sickening creak came from the floorboards beneath me, as if something huge was shifting beneath the wood, waiting. My pulse slammed against my ribs. "What does that mean?" She just smiled. The candles along the shelves flickered violently, their light stretching across the walls like clawed hands. The air itself seemed to tighten, as if the shop was breathing with me, against me. I took a step back. Something was behind me. Too tall, too thin. Wrong. The breath on my neck turned cold. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out, get away, escape. My legs carried me past the counters, past the antique furniture, past the endless, towering shelves. The whispering followed me, chasing me, its syllables curling through the air like unseen fingers. Then, a door. It hadn't been there before. A wooden door, old and worn, set into the back wall of the shop. The woman laughed softly behind me. "You won't like what's on the other side." I didn't care. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door yawned open, and the world dropped away. I wasn't in Hargrave's anymore. I wasn't anywhere anymore. The ground beneath me was soft, wet. The air was thick with fog, swallowing everything around me in a churning, pulsing darkness. The sky above was black, not the black of night, but something deeper. A blackness that stretched on forever, swallowing everything, watching. My breath trembled. My shoes sank into the ground with each step. Not mud, flesh. The realization hit me all at once. The ground was pulsing, alive. The texture beneath my feet was soft, slick, moving. I bit back a scream. A shape loomed in the mist. Tall, crooked, wrong. It stood in the distance, motionless, watching me without eyes. A thin, bony figure, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its mouth, if it had one, was stitched shut with something dark, something writhing. Then it moved. I stumbled backward, my stomach twisting, nausea rising in my throat. It didn't walk toward me. It glided. Like a shadow with weight, a sound rose from the fog, a low, guttural clicking. Not from the creature, from the ground. I looked down. The flesh beneath my feet was splitting. The sound wasn't clicking. It was teeth. Teeth emerging from the ground. Hundreds, thousands, pushing through the flesh like budding flowers, grinning, gnashing, chewing. and I was standing right in the middle of them. I ran. The mist swallowed me whole. The creature behind me let out a low, ragged moan, something between a scream and a death rattle. The air was thick with whispers, voices overlapping, spilling out of the fog like hands reaching for my throat. Then another door. It stood alone in the mist, impossibly out of place, carved from the same dark wood as the box. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open. The air snapped, and I was back. Hargraves. The candles still burned. The wooden shelves still stood. The scent of old books and coffee still clung to the air. But something was wrong. The woman was still behind the counter, smiling. "Now you understand," she murmured. I staggered forward, my pulse a violent drumbeat in my skull. My body felt wrong, like something inside me had shifted, something had changed. I swallowed. My voice was raw. What did I just see?" Her smile widened. "The thing you must feed." My hands trembled. My body ached in places it shouldn't. My fingers felt stiff, my skin too tight. I turned toward the counter and saw the box. Still there, still waiting. My breath hitched. Slowly, carefully, I reached for it, my fingers curling around the lid, and when I opened it, I saw my own teeth inside. Every single one. White, perfect, pulled from my own skull. And the whispering inside the box. It was still there, crawling inside my skull, curling around my thoughts, laughing. The box in front of me was full of my own teeth. Each one sat perfectly arranged, lined up in neat ivory rows. But I hadn't lost any teeth. My tongue ran over my gums, feeling every single one still in place. And yet, here they were. Something inside me shifted. The air in Hargraves grew heavy, pressing down on my shoulders, curling around my throat like invisible fingers. The woman behind the counter hadn't moved, her eyes locked on me, her smile stretching too wide, too knowing. My breath shuddered in my chest. This isn't real," I whispered. The whispering from the box grew louder. Real or not, I couldn't look away. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they hovered over the teeth. The moment my skin made contact, a shock of ice-cold pain lanced up my arm, driving straight into my skull. Then I saw. The shop was gone. I was standing in a room I'd never seen before, a long, narrow hallway lined with dozens of doors. The walls were old, peeling, the air thick with the scent of dust and something rotting. A sound echoed from the end of the hall, a slow, rhythmic scraping. I turned, my body too sluggish, too heavy, too wrong. The hallway stretched on forever, and in the distance, something moved. A shape crawled from the shadows, too long, too thin. Its limbs were bent backward, its body contorting as it dragged itself forward. The scraping sound wasn't from the walls, it was from its fingers, long, bone-thin fingers, nails like knives digging into the floor as it pulled itself closer, inch by inch. I couldn't move. The whispering was inside my head now, drilling into my thoughts, filling me up from the inside. Feed it. My stomach twisted violently. I knew what it meant. My teeth, it was waiting for them. I stumbled backward, my spine colliding with something solid, a door. The wood beneath my fingers was wet. I turned the handle, the door swung open, and I fell through. The air ripped around me, pulled me down, 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 until I landed, back in Hargraves. The counter was still in front of me, the candles were still burning, the woman was still watching, but the box was empty. My stomach dropped. No, I touched my mouth, smooth gums, every single tooth gone, and yet I could still feel them grinding together, still feel them moving in my jaw. A slow, creeping dread crawled through me. The moment my teeth were gone, I knew something had changed. But it wasn't just inside me. The entire shop had shifted. The air felt thicker. Every candle on the shelves flickered in sync, their flames stretching unnaturally long, bending as if watching me. The floor, once solid wood, had taken on a strange, unsteady give beneath my feet, like I was standing on something alive. The woman behind the counter, if she was even a woman anymore, tilted her head, her empty eyes locked on mine. "How do you feel?" I tried to speak, but the second my lips parted, something moved inside my throat. Not my tongue. Something else. I gagged, doubling over, my body revolting against the thing that had settled inside me. A whisper, a voice that wasn't my own, slid from my mouth like rotted silk. The sound wasn't right. It wasn't human. It was layered. Dozens of voices, hundreds, speaking at once, murmuring in a language that made my ears throb as if something was trying to claw its way into my brain. I clamped a hand over my mouth, choking it back. My vision swam. The shelves seemed to warp and breathe. The shadows stretched and crawled. I turned, eyes darting toward the door, except it wasn't there anymore. Where the entrance should have been, there was only darkness. Not an empty doorway, not a wall, just nothing. I staggered back. My chest ached. My lungs felt full, not with air, but with whispers. The woman, the thing behind the counter, was still smiling. "You're part of it now," she whispered. I shook my head. No. I hadn't agreed to this. I had followed the rules. I had followed them, hadn't I? My mind was foggy. My thoughts weren't mine anymore. Something else was pressing in, shaping them, twisting them. I tried to take a step back, but my foot met nothing. The floor, gone. The walls, melting. The shelves, the counter, the candles, dissolving into shadows. The shop itself was vanishing, sucked into the swirling dark. I was falling, or maybe sinking. The whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were outside of me now, too. I turned, and for the first time, I saw them. The customers, the ones I had been serving since the beginning. The faceless figures draped in tattered remnants of the past. The ones who never spoke. But now they were speaking. Not with mouths, with mine. They were inside me. I could feel them pulling, stretching, reshaping me. I tried to scream, but all that came out was laughter. Not mine, theirs. The woman behind the counter was still watching me. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Because I already knew. I wasn't leaving. I wasn't an employee anymore. I was part of the menu. The moment I realized I was part of the menu, the world around me collapsed. Not in the way a building falls, not with dust and debris, but like paper set ablaze. The shop burned away at the edges, curling into nothing, the flames cold and silent. My body stretched, pulled, unraveled, as if I was being rewritten. My skin no longer flesh, but something else entirely. Something wrong. I opened my mouth to scream, but the voices inside me laughed instead. They swelled up, pouring out, an unnatural sound that vibrated in my skull, in my bones. It was like being submerged in water, drowning in voices that weren't mine. I wasn't just in the shop anymore. I was inside it. I was it. I could feel the walls breathing, the floor shifting beneath unseen feet. The weight of centuries pressed down on me, the history of every customer, everything that had ever walked inside. They weren't just memories. They were still here, trapped, pressed between the wooden beams like preserved insects, frozen in time. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. Not entirely. I was no longer just me. I felt my arms stretch impossibly long, my fingers sharpening. My clothes dissolved, reforming into something heavy, something that reeked of old fabric and decay. My face, God, my face. I could feel it shifting, changing, warping into something that didn't belong to me anymore. I wanted to fight it, but how do you fight when your own body isn't yours? The whispers grew louder, shaping words I didn't understand, but somehow felt. You belong to us. You are one of us now. I willed my legs to move, to step back, to run, to do anything that could break whatever was happening to me. But the floor was no longer solid. It was like walking on the surface of a frozen lake, thin, fragile, ready to crack open and swallow me whole. And then I heard it, a bell. The sound cut through everything, sharp, clear, ringing through the space like a blade through flesh. The voices inside me shuddered. The walls froze. Something had changed. And then, just as suddenly as it had disappeared, the shop reassembled itself. The wooden floors snapped back into place. The walls straightened. The candles flickered back to life, their flames swaying as if watching me. But something was wrong. The counter was still there. The shelves, the cups, the strange antique cash register. But the woman behind the counter, the one who had smiled at me, who had spoken the words that sealed my fate, was gone. And in her place was someone else. A man. His face was thin, his skin grayed with age, but his eyes were the worst part. They were hollow, not like empty sockets, not like he was missing them, but like he had never needed them at all. He tilted his head, studying me. Then he spoke. "You shouldn't be here yet." My breath hitched. My voice, when I found it, was raw, fractured, barely mine anymore. What happened? He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. You weren't supposed to change yet. I didn't understand. None of this made sense. The last thing I remembered was the customers. I turned, expecting to see them still seated at the tables, sipping from their cups, their faces obscured by the thick, suffocating air of the shop. But they were all staring at me now, their cups untouched, their hands still. their heads tilted in unnatural angles, watching me with faces I couldn't quite make out. And then they stood, all at once, not like people, not like individuals, like puppets, like something was controlling them. And they spoke, not in a language I could understand, not in words that belonged to this world. It was a sound that hurt, a sound that cracked the space around me, that made the air shudder, that made my vision warp at the edges. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, inside my skull, inside my bones. I fell to my knees, gasping, trying to fight it, but I was losing myself again. The man behind the counter sighed. "You don't have much time." I forced myself to look at him. Time for what? His expression didn't change. To undo this. The word sent a bolt of something cold and sharp through my chest. I could undo this. But how? The customers, the things in front of me, moved closer. Their faces, God, their faces. They weren't blurry anymore. I could see them now. And they looked like me. Every single one. Identical. I staggered back, shaking my head. No, that's not possible. They opened their mouths and they spoke in my voice. "You belong to us." The man behind the counter moved fast. Too fast. His hand clamped around my wrist, his grip freezing, suffocating. And then, everything split apart. The shop, the voices, the air itself. Like I had been ripped out of time, like I had been yanked backward. The last thing I saw was the faces of the customers, my own face staring back at me 100 times over, their mouths still moving, shaping words I couldn't hear anymore. And then, I was somewhere else. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. My vision was a mess of colors that didn't make sense. Deep blacks that pulsed like veins, reds that shimmered like liquid, and shadows that moved when I wasn't looking at them. I wasn't in the shop anymore, but I wasn't anywhere familiar either. I wasn't anywhere real. Something shifted behind me, a sound like wet fabric peeling apart. I turned too fast, my balance faltering, and saw it. A door. Just standing there with nothing supporting it. It wasn't connected to a wall, wasn't attached to anything solid. It just existed. A warped wooden frame with a rusted handle, the surface covered in scratches that formed no recognizable pattern. Some looked like claw marks, others looked like words. I didn't want to get closer, but I could hear something on the other side. A voice, a whisper. It wasn't calling my name. It was breathing it. The sound curled into my ears, low, deliberate, the way something speaks when it already knows you'll listen. I backed away. My foot hit something soft. Not the floor, not solid ground. I looked down and almost screamed. Bodies, not fresh, not whole, just parts. Arms, legs, torsos, all stitched together in a tangled mess. Some were rotting, flesh slipping away to reveal bone. Others were too fresh, the wounds still glistening, veins still pulsing, like they weren't done dying yet. But the worst part, the part that made my breath catch, made my stomach drop into a pit of ice, was the faces. They were all mine. Every head, every severed throat, every blank, open-mouthed expression of agony, they all wore my face. I staggered back, gagging. The whisper behind the door turned into a chuckle. "You've been here before." The voice didn't come from one place. It came from everywhere. I turned, searching the darkness, but there was no source, no figure, just the door. And something moved behind it. The handle twitched. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. I didn't want to know. But my body, God, my body wasn't listening. My hand lifted, my fingers shaking, reaching toward the rusted handle, as if pulled by a force I couldn't resist. The whispering turned into laughter. Low, hungry. "Open it." I couldn't stop myself. My fingers touched the metal. It was ice cold, but pulsing, like it was alive. The second I gripped it, the world split apart. The darkness ripped open, and I was yanked through, falling, screaming, and then I hit the floor. Not hard, not painfully, just there, like I had always been there, like I had never left. I was back in the shop, the shelves, the counter, the flickering candlelight, exactly as it was before, as if none of it had happened. But something was different. The air was too still. The room was too empty. The seats that had once been filled with silent customers were now vacant. The only person left was the man behind the counter. His hollow eyes studied me, waiting. For what, I didn't know. I forced my legs to move, forced my voice to work. What the hell is happening to me? The man exhaled slowly. "You broke the rules." My stomach twisted. "The rules?" His expression didn't change. "You drank, you stayed too long, and now it's trying to keep you." I didn't have to ask what it was. I already knew. The shop, the thing inside it, the thing running it. I wasn't meant to leave. I wasn't meant to exist outside it anymore. I gritted my teeth, forcing back the panic clawing up my throat. How do I stop it? The man hesitated. For the first time, he looked almost pitying. You can't. The words felt like a slap to the face. There has to be a way. There was. His voice was quiet. But you didn't take it. Something inside me snapped. I slammed my hands on the counter, desperate. There has to be a way to fix this. The candle beside him flickered. For a moment, just a brief moment, his hollow eyes seemed to shift, like something behind them was watching me. And then he spoke. There is one thing. I stilled. He leaned forward. But it's not a choice you'll like. A chill crawled down my spine. I already knew what he was going to say. I had seen the empty seats. I had seen what happened to the ones before me. And now, it was my turn. His voice was barely a whisper now. You have to bring someone else in. My heart stopped. What? His fingers tapped against the counter. Slow, rhythmic. The shop needs customers. It needs new faces. His head tilted slightly. It won't let you leave unless you replace yourself. I shook my head, staggering back. No, I couldn't do that. I couldn't trap someone else here. I couldn't condemn someone to this. You have a choice, the man said. Bring someone else in, or stay forever. His hollow eyes held no malice, just understanding, because he had made the same choice once. And now, it was my turn. I backed toward the door, my breath ragged, my pulse hammering. It was closed now, waiting. The handle gleamed. I had a choice, but was it really a choice at all? The shop whispered around me. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that moved on their own. I could feel it, the hunger, the expectation. It wouldn't wait forever. I could feel it, the weight of its hunger pressing down on me, curling around my ribs, sliding cold fingers into my skull. The walls seemed to breathe, the candlelight flickered violently, and the air thickened, turning into something wet and heavy in my throat. I had to decide. I had to choose now. The man behind the counter didn't move, didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His hollow eyes held the truth. The only way out was to bring someone else in. My pulse thundered, my breath shuddering as I reached for the door. My fingers hovered over the handle, feeling the wrongness of it before I even touched it. It pulsed under my hand like a beating heart, alive in a way no object should ever be. I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the empty street outside. The night air was still, unnaturally so, as if the world beyond the shop was frozen in time, waiting for my decision. I stepped out. The moment my feet touched the pavement, the suffocating pressure eased. The weight that had crushed my lungs, the whispers curling in my ears, gone. But the hunger remained. I felt it watching me, waiting. I walked home in a daze, my mind replaying the man's words over and over. Bring someone else in. It was an impossible choice. Unthinkable. And yet, that thing in the shop, it wouldn't let me go. Not really. I had broken the rules. I had stayed too long. Drank what I wasn't supposed to. I wasn't free. I was on borrowed time. And if I didn't bring someone else in, it would come for me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, in that shifting darkness, the whispering door, the pile of severed heads that all wore my face. I woke up gasping, drenched in cold sweat, my hands shaking so hard I could barely move. I knew what I had to do. But who? Who could I lead to that place? I wasn't a killer. I wasn't a monster. And yet, I thought of the others, the ones who had done this before me, the man behind the counter, the people who had sat in those chairs, silent and unmoving. They had all made this choice once. That meant someone else had led me there. The thought made my stomach twist, but it didn't change the truth. I had to pick someone no one would miss, someone who wouldn't be traced back to me. The thought alone made me sick, but the hunger in the back of my skull, the ever-present pull of the shop's grasp, grew stronger with each passing hour. By the second night, it was unbearable. I felt watched at all times, even in my own home. The corners of my apartment stretched in ways they shouldn't. Shadows pooled in places where there was no light. It was creeping in. It was giving me a deadline. By the third night, I couldn't fight it anymore. I left my apartment, walking aimlessly through the streets, searching, praying for some kind of sign. That's when I saw him. A man. Homeless, sitting slumped against the wall of an alleyway, gaunt, exhausted, forgotten by the world. He looked up at me, his bloodshot eyes dull, hopeless. And I knew. I could do this. I could lead him there. I knelt beside him, voice steady despite the terror coiling inside me. "Hey, you need a warm place to go?" He blinked at me, suspicious. "I know a spot," I said, forcing a small, reassuring smile. "Not far. They give out free drinks, no questions asked." The hesitation flickered, but the hunger in his own eyes, a different kind of hunger than mine, made him nod. And just like that, he followed me. Each step felt heavier than the last. The shop's entrance loomed in the distance, the familiar red glow of its window flickering softly. As we neared the door, my stomach twisted so hard I thought I'd vomit. This was it. I was doing this. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling, and pushed the door open. The warm candlelight spilled out, the scent of something rich and sweet filling the air. The man beside me hesitated, and for 1 second, one agonizing second, I almost told him to run, to get out, to forget this place. But then, he stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. I staggered back, my breath hitching in my throat. The shop was silent. The glow from the window dimmed. And then, the pressure lifted. That suffocating hunger that had been gnawing at me for days, gone. I was free. I turned and walked away, my legs weak beneath me. The night air was cold against my skin. For the first time in days, I could breathe. But I didn't feel relief. I felt emptier than I ever had before. I had saved myself, but I had damned someone else to take my place. And deep down, I knew. Someday, he would have to do the same. The shop would go on. It always did. And someone new would be led to its door, just like I had been. Just like I had done. The cycle would never end. And that, I realized, was the worst part of all.